Okay, here's a question to start us off, maybe a bit of a mind bender. What if everything you perceive right now, every interaction, every memory, the actual feeling of the chair you're sitting on, what if it's all part of an incredibly sophisticated computer program?
Mhm.
Is that just like pure sci-fi fantasy, stuff for the movies? Or could it actually be a serious philosophical possibility, one we should maybe genuinely think about?
It's a fascinating question, isn't it? Really gets you thinking.
It does, and that's exactly what we're doing today. We're taking a deep dive into precisely that mind-bending idea. We're going to unpack a truly fascinating, sometimes pretty startling argument proposed by the philosopher Nick Bostrom.
Ah, yes, Bostrom's 2003 paper, Are We Living in a Computer Simulation?
That's the one. You've probably heard whispers of this idea around, maybe in pop culture, but Bostrom's work, it isn't fiction. It's a really carefully constructed philosophical argument, published in an academic journal, actually.
Right, the Philosophical Quarterly,
Hmm.
it's got real academic weight behind it.
Exactly. And it weaves together these seemingly separate fields like the future of computing, the nature of consciousness, even probability theory into this argument that makes you, well, fundamentally question reality itself.
It really does.
So, our mission today in this deep dive is to take you from maybe just being curious about this idea to being a really well informed thinker on it. We want to pull out the most important nuggets of knowledge from this source, which honestly can feel pretty dense sometimes.
It can be dense, yeah, but it's incredibly compelling once you get into it. And what's particularly fascinating, I think, is that Bostrom isn't trying to prove right now that we are in a simulation. That's not the main goal.
Okay, so what is he doing then?
He's constructing this probabilistic argument. He's basically saying, look, if we accept a few plausible assumptions about where technology and civilization might go, then at least one of three very specific possibilities has to be true.
Okay, so it's more like a logic puzzle with probabilities.
Exactly. It's about weighing these probabilities, thinking about what future intelligent life might actually be capable of doing, and then applying that logic back to our own situation, our own existence right now.
Yeah.
It's a profound intellectual exercise.
Right. And we're going to guide you through each of those three possibilities and really dig into what they mean for how we understand reality.
Hmm.
So let's get right to the core idea then. The central question Bostrom asks, it seems simple on the surface, but it's got huge implications. If future civilizations get their hands on just immense, almost unbelievable computing power,
Like truly astronomical levels of power.
right, and if they then have the ability to run incredibly detailed simulations of their ancestors, so basically people just like us, what does that imply about our own reality, right here, right now?
It all hinges on that, doesn't it? This idea of a post-human civilization.
Yeah, let's define that a bit. What does Bostrom mean by post-human?
Broadly, think of a civilization that's developed way beyond our current stage. Technologically mature, having overcome limitations we still face. They had harnessed, vast resources, maybe planetary scale engineering, capabilities consistent with known physics, but just scaled up immensely.
Okay, so if that kind of civilization can create these simulations, and this is crucial if the simulated minds inside them are actually conscious.
Which is a big assumption we'll need to unpack.
Definitely. But if they are conscious, then Bostrom says it just becomes a numbers game.
Exactly. The thought experiment plays out like this. Picture our descendants maybe millions of years from now. Their computing power dwarfs ours completely. What might they do with it?
Scientific research, entertainment.
Both? Maybe. But one really plausible thing Bostrom suggests is running detailed, high-fidelity simulations of their own history, their evolutionary pasts,
Waning.
meaning us, recreating entire populations, cultures, societies just like ours in intricate detail. Now, if these simulations are detailed enough,
Hmm.
and if, again, the big if, consciousness isn't strictly tied to biological brains like ours.
You mean it could run on silicon just as well as neurons?
That's the idea. It's called substrate independence. If that holds true, then the beings inside these simulations, they'd be just like us, conscious, experiencing joy, pain, love, confusion, everything, indistinguishable subjectively.
Okay, I think I'm following, but where does the numbers game part come in?
Right, here's where it gets really interesting. If these post-humans could run lots of these ancestor simulations, not just one or two, but thousands, millions, maybe billions of them,
Which they could, presumably, with all that computing power.
precisely, then statistically speaking, the vast overwhelming majority of conscious minds like ours wouldn't exist in the original base reality.
Maybe inside the simulations.
They'd be inside the simulations. Think about it like this. You have one real apple orchard, but you create a perfect digital simulation capable of running, say, 1 million virtual orchards, each identical.
Okay.
If you were then presented with an apple, chosen randomly from all the apples that exist, real and virtual, where is it most likely from?
From one of the million virtual orchards, obviously. The odds are stacked.
Exactly. The same logic applies to conscious minds if the conditions are met. The sheer number of simulated minds would dwarf the number of original biological minds.
Wow. Okay. That that really lands differently when you put it like that.
And Bostrom stresses this isn't just some, fun sci-fi thought experiment for a novel. He argues it forces us to confront really deep methodological questions like, how do we know what we know? And fundamental metaphysical questions about what reality is.
Right. It feels like it shifts the ground under your feet a bit.
It does. And here's something else, maybe a surprising aha moment for you listening. The argument draws these striking analogies to traditional religious concepts, but from a purely naturalistic standpoint.
How so? Like the simulators are gods.
In a functional sense, yes. Think about it. Beings who create our world, who are vastly more intelligent, who could potentially intervene in ways that break our laws of physics, effectively omnipotent within the simulation, and who could potentially know everything happening inside omniscient.
Huh. Okay, I see the parallel. It's like a technological creation myth.
Sort of, yeah.
Oh.
It reframes things like creation, omniscience, maybe even an afterlife, not as supernatural concepts, but as potentially measurable phenomena within a multi-layered reality. It's incredibly thought-provoking for ethics and purchase, too. We'll definitely circle back to that.
We have to. But first, to really get this argument off the ground, we need to dig into those big assumptions Bostrom makes. You mentioned two key ones.
That's right. Two crucial pillars holding up the whole structure.
Let's start with the first one. This idea of substrate independence of consciousness. That sounds technical.
It is a bit technical, yeah, but it's a core concept in philosophy of mind. Basically, it means that mental states, consciousness itself, isn't exclusively tied to the material it runs on.
So not just our squishy carbon-based brains.
Exactly. The idea is that consciousness is more about the computational structure and the processes, the patterns of information flow, rather than the specific stuff, the substrate, carrying out those processes.
Okay, so in theory, silicon chips in a computer, if arranged in the right way, could be conscious.
That's the core idea. And Bostrom is quite careful here. He doesn't need a super strong version of this, like saying mental states are only their functional roles. He just needs a weaker, more widely held assumption that if you could replicate the computational processes of a human brain at a fine enough level.
Like neuron by neuron, synapse by synapse.
Something like that, yeah. At a sufficiently fine-grained level, it would be enough to generate subjective experiences identical to ours. The feeling of seeing red, the pang of regret, the joy of discovery. All of it could emerge from the computation itself, regardless of whether it's happening in biological wetware or digital hardware.
But what about, all the messy biological stuff? Neurotransmitters, hormones, all that chemistry that definitely affects how we think and feel.
There's a really important question. Bostrom addresses this. He argues that the effect of those chemicals on our subjective experience likely happens because they influence the underlying computational activity.
Ah, so they change the signals, the information flow, and that's what matters for consciousness.
Precisely. It's like saying you don't necessarily need to simulate the chemical soup itself, molecule by molecule, if you can perfectly replicate how that soup affects the crucial information processing, the firing patterns, the connection strengths.
So if two brains have the exact same pattern of synaptic activity over time, they should have the exact same conscious experience, regardless of subtle chemical differences that didn't change that activity.
That's the line of reasoning, yes. If there's no subjective difference, without a difference in their relevant computational processes, like synaptic discharges, then simulating at that level, or maybe even a slightly higher level of abstraction, should be enough.
But isn't that still a huge leap? I mean, lots of people argue consciousness is deeply tied to biology, an emergent thing from our specific physical makeup. Does Bostrom just wave that away?
He doesn't wave it away, no.
Yeah.
He acknowledges it's a major area of debate in neuroscience and philosophy. But for the argument to work, he posits substrate independence as a plausible assumption, one that many people working on computational theories of mind find reasonable.
So he's not claiming it's proven fact, but saying, let's assume this is possible for that kind of argument and see where it leads.
Exactly. It's a necessary premise. If consciousness fundamentally can't be simulated on a computer, then much of the rest of the argument doesn't get off the ground. But if it can,
Mm.
well, that opens the door.
Okay, all right. So that's assumption number one. Consciousness isn't necessarily tied to biology. What's the second big assumption?
The second one is about technology,
Hmm.
specifically the technological capabilities of these post-human civilizations we talked about.
Right, the ones with the godlike computing power. Now, we have to admit, right now, today, we're nowhere near that. We don't have the hardware, we don't have the software to create conscious AI. Not even close.
Absolutely not. We're still figuring out much simpler things. But Bostrom argues there are pretty compelling reasons to think that technological progress, if it continues, will eventually overcome these hurdles.
Eventually being the key word. It doesn't have to be next century.
Now, the timescale doesn't actually matter that much for the logic of the argument. It could be thousands of years, millions of years, as long as some civilizations eventually reach that post-human stage.
The stage where they have access to basically near limitless resources and understand physics well enough to build these mega computers.
Exactly. They could potentially convert entire planets, asteroids, maybe even build Dyson spheres or similar megastructures purely for computation,
Yeah.
harnessing stellar levels of energy for processing.
Can you even imagine that kind of power? A single computer with the mass of Jupiter, say. The paper gives some numbers, right?
It does, and they are genuinely mind-boggling. He cites estimates like Eric Drexler's idea for a sugar cube-sized nanocomputer doing 1021 operations per second.
Wow.
Then there's an estimate for a planetary mass computer reaching something like 1042 operations per second.
10 to the power of 42. I can't even visualize that number. It's just astronomically huge.
It is, and maybe even more theoretically, Seth Lloyd calculated an upper bound for a 1 kilogram computer using quantum effects at maybe 5 times 1050 operations per second. Even if these are off by orders of magnitude, the point is the potential computing power is just immense, far beyond anything needed for just running society.
Okay, so the hardware potential is there in the distant future. But what about the cost of actually running a simulation of a human mind? That must still be huge, right?
It's significant, definitely. Yeah. Bostrom looks at different estimates. One, based on like replicating the processing done by the retina, suggests maybe 1014 operations per second for the whole brain.
Okay, 10 to the 14th, still a big number.
Another estimate, based on the number of synapses and how often they fire, puts it a bit higher, maybe 1016 or 1017 operations per second.
So somewhere in that ballpark.
Right. And while simulating every tiny biological detail might push it higher, Bostrom suggests there's probably a lot of redundancy in our brains. Non-biological processors might be way more efficient. He also argues memory is less of a constraint than raw processing speed. Even the data coming from our senses is relatively small compared to the internal brain activity.
So the main cost is simulating the thinking, the consciousness itself.
It seems to be the bottleneck, yes.
Yeah.
But even at 1017 operations per second per brain, remember that planetary computer doing 1042 ops per second?
Yeah.
It could run, well, billions or trillions of those brain simulations simultaneously.
Easily. Okay. The scale is just hard to wrap your head around. But wait, what about simulating the world around those brains? You can't just have brains in vats. They need an environment, right? Do they need to simulate the entire universe down to the quantum level?
Good question. And no, Bostrom says that would be totally infeasible and, crucially, unnecessary.
Unnecessary. How?
The trick is, you only need to simulate what's necessary for the simulated beings, not to notice anything's amiss. You only need to simulate what they can actually observe or interact with.
Okay, so you don't need to simulate the core of the Earth atom by atom.
Exactly. Unless someone drills down there, who's going to know? Distant galaxies could just be essentially high-res images or compressed data until someone points a really powerful simulated telescope at them. Then you render the necessary detail on demand.
So it's about selective detail. Focus the computing power where it's needed.
Precisely. You simulate the local environment, the stuff people interact with, continuously. But microscopic details or things happening far away, you can kind of fill them in as needed, like textures loading in a video game, but way more sophisticated.
What if someone looks closely, like with a microscope?
Bostrom introduces this idea of a director system overseeing the simulation. It could potentially track what everyone believes or intends to observe, If someone's about to use a microscope, the system quickly generates the necessary microscopic detail just in time.
And if something goes wrong, an anomaly.
The director could potentially edit the memories of anyone who noticed, or even just rewind the simulation a few seconds and rerun it slightly differently to avoid the glitch. It implies a huge amount of control.
That's slightly terrifying, that level of control. Okay, so we have a potentially infinite computing power and clever ways to simulate minds and environments without simulating everything. Now let's talk scale. Ancestor simulations, how many could they run?
This is where the numbers get truly staggering. Bostrom does a back-of-the-envelope calculation. Estimate maybe 100 billion humans have ever lived.
Okay, rough number, sure.
Each lives, say, 50 years on average.
Yeah.
That's about 1.5 billion seconds. Multiply that by the number of humans and the operations per second per brain we talked about, 1014 to 1017.
Right. Just quick mental math fails. That's going to be a huge number.
It comes out to something like 133 to 1036 total operations needed to simulate the entire mental history of humankind.
Okay, 10 to the 30-something. That sounds impossibly large.
It is. But remember that planetary computer, the one doing 242 operations per second?
Yeah.
It could run that entire the whole history of human thought using less than 1/millionth of its processing power for 1 second.
Wait, seriously?
Seriously. That's the calculation.
The entire history of human consciousness simulated in a fraction of a second by a tiny fraction of one future computer's power.
According to these estimates, yes. And now imagine that post-human civilization doesn't just build one such computer. They could build millions, billions of them. Maybe dedicate entire star systems to computation.
So they could run an unbelievable number of ancestor simulations.
A truly astronomical number. Even if our estimates are way off by factors of thousands or millions, the sheer scale means they could likely run vastly more simulated histories than the one original history. This conclusion is pretty robust, even with large error margins.
Okay. My head is officially spinning a bit, but I see the logic. If assumption 1, consciousness can be simulated, and assumption 2, future tech allows massive computation, are true,
Then the sheer number of possible simulated minds like ours could vastly outnumber the original ones.
which leads us directly to Bostrom's main argument, the trilemma.
Exactly. If we accept those two assumptions, substrate independence and future computing power, Bostrom argues we're forced into a stunning conclusion. It's a disjunction. A logical or at least one of three distinct possibilities must hold true.
It's like the universe presents us with 3 doors, and logic demands at least one of them is open.
That's a great way to put it. And the core question becomes, if all the conditions are met, if they can run these simulations, and if simulated minds are conscious, why wouldn't they? And if they would, why wouldn't we likely be in one? The trilemma formalizes this.
All right, let's break down these 3 doors, the 3 propositions of the trilemma. What's the first one?
Proposition 1 is written as FP0. The F stands for fraction, P for post-human. So the fraction of human-level civilizations that actually reach a post-human stage is very close to 0.
Okay, translate that. What does it mean for us?
It means we almost certainly go extinct before we get there, before we develop that godlike computing power. Bostrom calls this the extinction hypothesis.
So this implies a high probability of doom, essentially. Humanity hits some kind of wall.
Pretty much. A great filter, as some call it. Now, importantly, this doesn't mean doom is like next week. It just means that looking across all civilizations that might arise in the universe, very, very few make it all the way to the post-human stage.
We could potter along at our current level for millennia and then get wiped out by an asteroid or climate change
Or, as Bostrom specifically mentions, maybe by developing powerful but uncontrollable technologies.
Yeah.
He gives the example of molecular nanotechnology, self-replicating nanobots running amok.
The gray goo scenario.
Exactly, a technology that spirals out of control and consumes the biosphere. So, option 1 is grim. We don't get to run simulations because we destroy ourselves or get destroyed first. That's one way the argument resolves.
Okay, door number 1, extinction. What's behind door number 2?
Door number 2 is FM0. Here, M stands for motivation, or maybe many simulations. It means the fraction of post-human civilizations that actually bother to run a significant number of ancestor simulations is close to 0.
So in this scenario, they reach the post-human stage, they have the computing power, but they just don't do it.
Exactly. They have the ability, but lack the interest or the will to run lots of simulations of their past. For this to be true, Bostrom argues, there must be a really strong convergence among advanced civilizations.
Meaning pretty much all of them, everywhere. independently decide not to do this. That seems unlikely, given how diverse motivations usually are.
It does seem unlikely, which is part of the argument's force. But what could cause such convergence? One possibility Bostrom floats is ethics.
Ethics, like they decide simulating conscious beings who might suffer is wrong.
Precisely. Maybe there's a universal ethical realization among hyper-advanced beings that running ancestor simulations with all the potential suffering involved is fundamentally immoral. And this ethical view would have to be so strong and widespread that it's effectively enforced across their entire civilization, or perhaps across all post-human civilizations.
That implies a level of ethical consensus and control far beyond anything humanity has ever achieved.
Massively beyond. Or another possibility. Maybe they just lose the desire. Our current human motivations, curiosity about history, scientific inquiry, even entertainment, maybe those seem utterly primitive or silly to post-human minds.
Like, why simulate the messy past when you can explore pure mathematics or directly stimulate pleasure centers?
Something like that. Perhaps the scientific value is negligible to them. Maybe they find fulfillment in ways we can't even conceive, rendering ancestor simulations totally uninteresting. Or perhaps their societal structure is just fundamentally different. Maybe lacking the kind of wealthy, independent individuals who might just run simulations for fun or research, like we might imagine doing.
So, Proposition 2 suggests a future that's either incredibly ethically uniform or just profoundly alien in its motivations compared to ours.
Yes, it implies post-human societies would be vastly different from ours, converging on not running these simulations for some deep-seated reason, be it ethical or motivational. It raises the question, what kind of civilization would that even be?
Okay, that's door number 2. They can, but they don't. What's the final door? Proposition 3.
Proposition 3 is FSIM 1. FSIM is the fraction of observers with experiences like ours who are living in a simulation. This proposition says that fraction is very close to 1,
Meaning?
meaning we are almost certainly living in a computer simulation. Right now, this is the simulation hypothesis proper.
Okay. Wow, this is the one that really grabs you, isn't it?
It's conceptually the most jarring, absolutely. If this is true, then everything we see, the stars, the galaxies, the laws of physics we measure, it's all part of a simulated reality. Our universe isn't the base level of reality.
It's like we're living inside a vastly complex video game run on a computer in some other more fundamental universe.
That's the essence of it, yes. The physics of the real universe outside might be totally different from ours. Our reality is constructed, simulated.
And this opens up weird possibilities, right? Like simulations within simulations.
Potentially, yes. Bostrom discusses this. A simulated civilization could itself become post-human within its simulation. And then, using its simulated computers, it could run its own ancestor simulations.
Like running a virtual machine inside another virtual machine.
Exactly. You could have stacks of simulations, nested realities, potentially many levels deep.
That's dizzying. And what does that imply for us if we eventually create ancestor simulations?
That's a crucial point. If we do manage to create conscious ancestor simulations ourselves, that would be strong evidence against Proposition 1, we didn't go extinct, and Proposition 2, we were interested.
Which was like only.
Proposition 3, it would dramatically boost the probability that we are simulated. And if we're simulated, maybe our simulators are simulate too, and so on up the chain.
So reality could be layers upon layers of simulations. Does it ever stop? Is there a basement reality?
Bostrom suggests there probably is a fundamental basement-level reality where the first simulators exist. But its nature is, well, pretty much unknowable to us within the simulation. There's also a counter-argument. The computational cost might become prohibitive. Simulating a whole post-human civilization within a simulation might be too resource-intensive.
Meaning maybe simulations get shut down before they reach the stage where they can simulate others?
That's a possibility he raises, yeah?
Yeah.
A potential constraint on infinite nesting.
You mentioned earlier the analogies to religious concepts with this third option. Let's revisit that. The simulators as gods.
Yes, the parallels are quite striking, aren't they? They create our world. They're super intelligent compared to us. They're potentially omnipotent within our simulated physics. They could change the rules or intervene directly. And omniscient, they can know everything happening inside.
It maps surprisingly well.
It does. It even leads to this idea of a naturalistic theogony. If you suspect you might be in a simulation, but not necessarily the first simulation, maybe you're level 5 deep, then your simulators might be like demigods who are themselves subject to judgment or rules from their simulators higher up.
So everyone has a reason to behave well, just in case the beings one level up are watching.
Kind of, yeah. It creates this potential for a universal ethical imperative based on rational self-interest, even without direct proof of being watched. A virtuous circle emerging from the very structure of nested reality. Even an afterlife isn't entirely off the table. Simulators could potentially copy or reboot a consciousness after the simulation ends.
This is bending my brain. What about those selective simulations you mentioned, where maybe only I am real and everyone else is a philosophical zombie?
Right? The me simulation idea, where only one or a few minds are fully simulated and the rest are just convincing fakes, shadow people. Bostrom acknowledges this possibility.
Is it like
Well, he argues you shouldn't assume you're in one unless these selective simulations are vastly more common than the full ancestor simulations we've been discussing, like orders and orders of magnitude more common. Otherwise, statistically, you're still more likely to be in a full simulation with lots of other conscious beings.
Okay, that makes sense. And there was that weird idea about false memories and suffering.
Ah, yeah, that was a very speculative aside. The idea that maybe simulators could implant false memories, so perhaps all our experiences of suffering aren't real. But as Bostrom notes, that's only really plausible when you're not actually suffering yourself. It's hard to believe your pain is unreal when you're feeling it.
Right, okay. So, Proposition 3. We're likely in a simulation run by godlike posthumans, possibly nested in other simulations, with all these strange philosophical and quasi-theological implications. This feels huge. How does Bostrom say we should react to this? If it's true, does anything change?
This is where he brings it back down to earth a bit. He argues the practical implications might not be all that radical.
Really, how can the idea that reality isn't real not be radical?
Well, think about it. How do we learn about the world? Through observation and experiment, right? Even if this world is a simulation, the best guide we have to how it works, how the programmer set it up, is still to study the simulation itself. Empirical science remains our best tool.
So physics experiments still work, chemistry still works.
Mhm.
We just acknowledge it might be simulated physics and chemistry.
Exactly. The laws might be implemented code rather than fundamental reality, but there's still the laws governing our existence. So Bostrom says the truth of Proposition 3 shouldn't make us go crazy or stop making plans or predictions. Our day-to-day lives, our science, our ethics, they largely proceed as before. The adjustments to our beliefs would be subtle, mostly because we just don't know anything about the simulators or their motives.
So keep calm and carry on studying the simulation.
Pretty much, yeah. Although there's that interesting wrinkle. If computational costs are a factor, and simulators might shut down simulations that get too complex or reach post-humanity, then maybe our best hope for long-term survival within the simulation framework is actually that Proposition 2 is true, that post-humans just don't run simulations. Because if Proposition 3 is true and cost is an issue, maybe reaching our own post-human stage triggers the end simulation button.
Huh. That adds another layer of complexity. So believing we're simulated might paradoxically make us hope that advanced beings don't simulate.
Or at least that they don't shut down simulations that become advanced. It's tricky.
Okay, before we get completely lost in nested realities, let's bring it back to the core argument. Why should we actually give credence to any of this, especially Proposition 3? Just because future beings could run simulations doesn't automatically mean we are in one, does it?
That's the absolutely crucial step. How do we connect the possibility of future simulations to our own situation? This is where Bostrom introduces a principle he calls the bland indifference principle.
Bland indifference sounds, well, bland.
Huh? Maybe. But it's quite specific and important here. It basically says this. Imagine we know that a certain fraction, let's call it X, of all observers with experiences just like ours are living inside simulations.
Okay, like X% of people like me are simulated.
Right. Now, if we have no other information, no specific evidence suggesting our particular experiences are more likely to be real or simulated compared to anyone else in that group.
Which we presumably don't. How could we tell from the inside?
Exactly. If we lack that distinguishing information, then the bland indifference principle states that our rational credence, our degree of belief that we are in a simulation, should simply be X.
So if 99% of minds like mine are simulated, I should be 99% confident I'm simulated.
Yes, assuming you have no special reason to think you're in the 1% biological group. Bostrom emphasizes this principle is weak and specific. It doesn't mean we should be indifferent about everything. It only applies when we lack information that differentiates our own case within a known statistical distribution.
Can you give an analogy?
Sure. Using an analogy with junk DNA. Imagine scientists discover that, say, 50% of the population has a specific harmless sequence S in their junk DNA. It has no observable effect whatsoever. Okay. Now, unless you've had your own DNA sequence to check for S, what should your belief be about whether you have it?
Well, 50%, obviously.
Right. That's the bland indifference principle. It holds even if, hypothetically, having S somehow subtly changed your subjective experience, because everyone's subjective experience is unique anyway,
Mm.
you still have no specific information placing you in the S or non-S group.
So, applying that to simulations, if the total number of simulated minds like ours vastly outnumbers the original biological ones, meaning some is close to one,
Right.
and we have no way to tell if we're biological or simulated.
That implying bland indifference, our rational belief should be that we are almost certainly simulated. That sim is one.
Is this related to that controversial doomsday argument?
Bostrom explicitly distinguishes it. The doomsday argument relies on assuming we're a random sample from all humans who will ever live, past, present, future, which is a much stronger, more debatable assumption. Bland indifference here only applies to the set of currently existing observers with human-type experiences, given a possible distribution between real and simulated. It's about lacking information now about which group you're in.
Okay. And he uses a betting scenario, too.
Yeah, just to reinforce the rationality. If, say, 99.9% of people are in simulations and everyone adopts the bland indifference principle and bets accordingly.
Then 99.9% of people betting they're simulated will win their bet.
Exactly. And 99.9% betting they aren't simulated will lose. It suggests that aligning your belief with the statistical probability, when you lack distinguishing information, is the rational approach. It makes the leap to believing FSIM your one feel more intuitively correct if you accept the underlying premises about the vast number of potential simulations.
Right. If you imagine the fraction slowly increasing 90%, 95%, 99%, 99.99%, your rational belief should track that, eventually approaching certainty.
Precisely. It's not an irrational leap, but a logical consequence of the assumptions and the principle of indifference.
Okay. This has been a lot to process. Let's try to quickly recap the whole argument, the trilemma.
Sure. So Bostrom starts with the premise that a technologically mature post-human civilization would have enormous computing power.
Right. Assumption 2.
And assumption 1 is that consciousness is substrate independent, meaning it could be simulated on that hardware.
Okay. Given those two,
He argues that at least one of these three propositions must be true.
FB is 0. The fraction reaching post-humanity is near 0. We go extinct first.
The extinction hypothesis.
2. FM is 0. The fraction of post-humans interested in running lots of ancestor sims is near 0. They can, but they don't.
The rare simulation hypothesis.
Or 3, FSIM and a 1. The fraction of observers like us who are living in a simulation is near 1. We are almost certainly simulated.
The simulation hypothesis. Extinction, lack of interest, or simulation. One of these has to be the case.
That's the core conclusion. And in our current state of ignorance, without strong evidence pointing clearly to one over the others,
Bostrom suggests we should probably split our belief, our credence, roughly evenly between the three.
that seems like a reasonable starting point, yes. Maybe not exactly 1/3 each, but not putting all our eggs in one basket yet.
And this leads to that final paradoxical thought, the kicker.
Yes. The kicker is, unless we are currently living in a simulation, meaning Proposition 3 is true, then it must be the case that either we go extinct before becoming posthuman, Proposition 1, or posthumans simply don't run ancestor simulations, Proposition 2.
So, unless we're simulated now, our descendants will almost certainly never run simulations of us.
That's the implication. It's like the very act of us not being simulated now virtually guarantees our descendants won't simulate us. It's a strange kind of self-consistency loop.
Wow. That is a thought to chew on. It really ties the whole thing together in a very provocative way.
It certainly does. It leaves you looking at the future and our present quite differently.
So this deep dive leaves us, and you the listener, with this profound question hanging in the air. If one of these three scenarios, extinction, cosmic convergence on indifference, or us being simulated is almost certainly true, and assuming we'd prefer to avoid extinction, what does that mean? Are there actions we could take, decisions we could make that might subtly nudge the probabilities, especially if we entertain the idea we might be living in scenario 3, potentially being observed?
It opens up a whole new dimension to thinking about existential risk, ethics, and maybe even the direction of our own technological development, doesn't it?
It really does. What part of this whole argument stands out most to WeHost you, thinking about it now? What's the piece you'll be mulling over?